Real Talk USA.
It's my house, come on, turn it up.
Good afternoon, everyone. You're listening to Real Talk USA on Afro FM 105.3. It's Ms. Gabwata Dessa with you here today. Welcome to yet another segment of Real Talk USA. As mentioned in earlier programs, USAU and the African Union have jointly organized a Countering Violent Extremism Week in partnership with the Institute of Security Studies. It took place at the African Union this week, October 29th to November 1st. It is in fact wrapping up as we speak. So today we are again highlighting the issue of how to counter violent extremism. We all remember the interesting conversation we had on this show with Mr. Mashood Rizvi from Pakistan a couple of weeks back, who spoke to us about CVE issues in his corner of the world. Today we have two guests that we have interviewed separately from two separate parts of the world. Both will be talking to us about certain aspects of violent extremism and the U.S. approach, or policy, if you will, towards countering violent extremism. First, we will hear from Mr. Martin Dale, the Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. mission to Somalia. Chris and I spoke with him about violent extremism in Somalia and what the United States' commitment looks like in fighting it over there. Next, we will hear from Ms. Mariyam Cementwala, who is a policy advisor at the Office of International Religious Freedom in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. So first, I yield the floor to Chris and our first guest. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Ms. Gabwata Dessa for Real Talk USA, and I'm here with
Chris Mead. How's everybody doing today?
Very well, thank you, Chris. I'm hoping everyone else who's listening is also doing great. Who do we have here today?
Well, Mez, today we have Marty Dale, who's the Chargé d'Affaires for U.S. Embassy Somalia. We're having him online today because next the week of October 29th, we are conducting our second annual U.S. and African Union joint Countering Violent Extremism Week. So throughout the month, we tried to focus a little bit on countering violent extremism. And so today we have an interesting perspective from the Horn, from Somalia. Marty Dale, welcome to Real Talk USA.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be with you. Thank you again for the invitation and opportunity to speak with you and Mez today on Real Talk USA. It's very exciting and wanted to applaud your efforts for the USA holding its second annual CVE week starting on October 21st. I think it's a great opportunity to talk about countering violent extremism in the Horn.
Well, very good. Thank you for taking the time today of your schedule, and really appreciate you being on Real Talk USA. I thought that we could start up with a couple of warm-up questions, just to get to know you a little bit better. How long have you been with the State Department?
Thanks, Chris, for that question. Yeah, I started with the State Department in 2002, and I've served previously in Guyana and South America, Sierra Leone, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Sudan and South Sudan, Switzerland, my hardship tour, as I like to call it, Nairobi, working for then what was called the Somalia unit, beginning in 2013, where I was the political economic counselor from 2013 to 2016, and then 1 year back in the department working for legislative affairs, where I was working on counterterrorism issues and also Near Eastern Maghreb affairs issues, and then back to Nairobi to be Deputy Chief of Mission, and now I'm currently the Chargé d'Affaires.
Well, you've crammed a lot in was 16 years of the State Department, and it sounds like your career. I've been to Afghanistan and South Sudan. My hardship was Australia, but it sounds like I was a Marine in a past life, so it sounds like we have similar interests. And so I was wondering if. How long have you been working on Somalia issues?
So, starting in 2013 and through 16, I was as I said earlier, I was the political economic counselor, and then started back in July of 2017 as the Deputy Chief of Mission, and then became the Chargé d'Affaires. So, Somalia obviously is near and dear to my heart, and I think we've seen tremendous progress over the past 5 to 6 years. Nonetheless, we still have a lot of work ahead of us, and we're really committed, have a fantastic team here on the ground, and very excited about the work.
Okay, can you give us an overview of U.S.-Somalia relations?
Yeah, so we have really close relationships with Somalia. We recognized them in January 2013, and ever since we've been working very closely with them, particularly on the counterterrorism front. And they've been a fantastic partner moving ahead to prevent the radicalization of populations in Somalia and trying to help us. And we provide assistance to help them build economic prosperity and stability in Somalia. So we feel like we have a fantastic relationship with the government, especially the current government. President Farmajo, he is, as I think everyone knows, he's an American citizen and has been a great partner to the United States.
Can you describe some of the U.S. support for Somalia's development? You mentioned it has we got some work, still have some work to do there. But Somalia's been, we'd like it to be a peaceful and stable country. Can you give us sort of an overview of what our support for Somalia looks like?
Yeah. So the support it sort of comes in threefold. It comes in a lot of counterterrorism security assistance, and then we're doing a lot of development assistance with USAID. USAID program here has a fantastic and strong team. They're working very closely with the federal member states to build reconciliation amongst communities that are coming out of, as you know, nearly 30 years of anarchy and civil war, where people did not have a lot of trust and also were not receiving security and services from the government. So we're looking at how we can help the government build its capacity to deliver services to the people and bring governance to ungoverned spaces. And in doing so, we obviously work very closely with the federal government in Mogadishu, but we have strong relationships with the federal member states as well. And so our assistance is going to building community reconciliation, providing assistance builds confidence in government and security, and builds trust in building the capacity of the federal government to bring governance, rule of law, to have police, to bring health services, so that the people of Somalia know that the government is looking out for them and has their best interests at heart.
Can you talk a little bit about the reconciliation issue? So, can you describe a little bit the underlying issues in Somalia? What's driven that country to the state that it's in, and who needs to be reconciled with each other?
So, as you know, it's a very strong clan community or clan base in Somalia, and it's building the trust between the various groups that are on the ground. Land, obviously, is always an issue, and ownership, and making sure that people have access to the means to be able to facilitate their livelihood. And as you know, it's a very pastoral society, a lot of nomadic people with livestock and agriculture, but you're also seeing a movement towards urbanization, where you're having lots of young people and other people moving to urban centers. And so when you have these movements and you have conflicts between clans, it can lead very quickly to violence and conflict. And so what the Somalis, I take my hat off to them. They're tremendous when it comes to sitting down and having down and having conversations among themselves to promote reconciliation over maybe years of conflict, where they understand now that they need to sit down and find resolution so that they can move ahead and improve the livelihood of all communities.
So when we're talking about building trust, how can people, what kind of trust building programs are there? Like, how do you build trust between people who may not necessarily talk to each other?
So a lot of what USAID is doing, for example, is they're facilitating these discussions amongst communities at the kind of the grassroots level, and so they're having communities come together where we're providing assistance to facilitate these meetings, and then they're just literally sitting down and talking through all the issues. And so, like, whether it's land issues, whether it's one clan has been more dominant than other clans, and making an inclusion of all the various, like, minority clans, and then also when it comes to the terrorists, Al-Shabaab, we've helped with reconciliation for terrorists who have come off the battlefield and have defected and basically said they don't adhere to that ideology anymore, and help facilitate their reconciliation and reintegration into those communities. So it's basically setting the conditions on the ground to make it conducive for people to have constructive discussions in a conducive environment where they are making progress, and then they're setting up district administrations, they're setting up councils, they're working with the clan elders who still have play a very prominent role in Somalia to help facilitate kind of a traditional justice and other things that facilitate more of a predictable lifestyle when it comes to rule of law and governance, and when people have need to have conflict resolution when it comes to justice, and providing courts and other things to help resolve some of their problems.
Can you describe a little bit, you mentioned counterterrorism, but, there's, the way that I describe the difference between counterterrorism and countering violent extremism is that there's sort of a continuum, right? Like, countering terrorism, once it gets to that point, people have already decided that they are going to take an active role in destruction, right? But when you countering violent extremism is trying to get people who might be already heading down that road to think twice. And can you describe some of the issues that go into countering violent extremism? What are some of the issues? I mean, you covered some of them, like governance, service delivery. Are there other issues in Somalia that are potential issues that can lead somebody to go down the wrong road?
No, absolutely. Great question, Chris. First, maybe to start off with why it's in the interest of the United States to kind of do the to help facilitate countering violent extremism. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's in our interest and in the interest of our partners and allies in the Horn that we have regional stability, and this is why it's critical that we feel it's critical for us to be there on the ground. We're also looking at how we can use disruptive tactics that are used by the violent extremism to attract new recruits. We're looking at how we can counter that, and then we're also building, as I stated a little bit earlier, building alternatives and capabilities and resiliencies in targeted and at-risk communities and populations to reduce the risk of people being radicalized and recruited by the terrorists. So some of the things that I'll give you some examples of our activities on the ground. So some of our assistance is going, for instance, for the Somalia National Program for the Treatment and Handling of Disengaged combatants. And so for that goal, we're looking at how we enhance the public understanding of the national program. And secondly, we're looking at how Somali community leaders and civil society can advance the process of reconciliation and reintegration of these, what we would kind of term or deem lower level or lower risk Al-Shabaab combatants in key urban areas. We're also working with civil society to develop these multimedia campaigns on important social and cultural issues to showcase sort of the successive paths for youth and society and delegitimize al-Shabaab's violent extremist narratives. On the al-Shabaab side, al-Shabaab is very skilled with their media campaign and with their propaganda. And so we're looking at how we can combat sort of this skill set that al-Shabaab has by fostering, a sense of individual and communal identity that builds resilience and skills to counter these narratives and ideology and to change attitudes and behaviors. So it's kind of winning hearts and minds. Mm-hmm. One example is we looked at the impact of we had an evaluation of USAID's recently completed Somalia Youth Learners Initiative that found that combining secondary education with civic engagement reduces youth support for political violence more than education alone. So we're looking at, the combination of factors that can help strengthen basically the citizens' confidence in their governance in institutions and reducing the space so that we're creating more white space for the government to come in and fill it.
I have two sort of follow-up questions that are maybe a little bit down in the weeds. We can see if you can answer them. Would like to. Why? Let's step back. Why is the United States involved in Somalia? I mean, we're so far away. Why are we taking such an active role in helping Somalia reconcile itself to the new government and to each other?
Thanks, Chris. I think, it comes down to Somalia is an area, it's obviously a very strategic area in the Horn. And we have, I think right now we have probably one of the greatest opportunities that we have ever had with Somalia, given the close the bilateral relationship we have with the current government, the willingness of the government to work with us to facilitate this white space for, taking these ungoverned spaces and making them into governed spaces. If you were to ask, when we have congressional delegations that come and speak with us, and they ask us this very question, we're like, well, let's get ahead of the problem, the root of the problem, addressing it in a constructive manner, and it's also, in a cost-effective manner, where we're not where we're being extremely responsible for the U.S. taxpayer dollar in our investment in Somalia, where, it's not based on necessarily on nation building, but building capacity and showing them how to be able to do things on their own. So as we like to say, we say Somali solutions for Somali problems. And what we try to do in working with our international partners is to facilitate building their capacity so that they can do this stuff on their own. It kind of comes down to Administrator Green's new approach to development assistance is, we're basically looking for how we work ourselves out of a job by building capacity and help to bring stability to Somalia so that the Somali people and the Somali government and Somali civil society can work in conjunction to build, more stability and economic prosperity for the people of Somalia. Are so deserving of it after nearly 30 years of civil war.
They've been through a lot for sure. So, sir, I would like to ask one final question, and I think it's very interesting to me. So, countering violent extremism is sort of about what we can do to prevent people from heading down the wrong road and becoming an active terrorist. I'm kind of interested on the other end. You mentioned folks that are kind of leaving al-Shabaab, and you're working on reintegrating them into Somali society. Do you have any anecdotes about former fighters why are they leaving al-Shabaab, and what's the process of getting them to, what are some of the challenges of getting them reintegrated into everyday society?
Chris, great question. What it comes down to, a lot of the attraction to terrorist activity is strictly economic. It's because people don't have opportunities, don't have jobs, don't have livelihoods, and are looking just for a simple way to support their families. Obviously, terrorism is not the way to support your family, because ultimately you may be leaving your family. What we're seeing is that al-Shabaab, if you present opportunities for people through building economic prosperity, building job opportunities, building education, building exchanges. There is tremendous potential in Somalia, and it's just a matter of getting it right and making the right decisions where the government is making the right decisions, facilitating reconciliation, increasing trust amongst the population, where people begin to see, for example, they see security forces as reliable, as partners in rule of law and in governance. So, for example, in the past, a lot of the security forces have been seen as kind of part of the problem because they were taxing or they were not helping the communities. And what we're looking at is how we can help the Somalis solve their own problems by building the capacity of, say, security forces, Somali National Army, Somali Police, the Somali Darwish, the community civics services, where people begin to actually see that government is reaching out to them to facilitate and improve their livelihood. So, for example, you're no longer seeing Somali National Army checkpoints along these main supply routes or these main thoroughways through Somalia where people say, okay, I can actually get to the market and not have to pay an exorbitant amount of money to get through all these checkpoints. It's because the government is coming in and providing security, with the assistance of international partners. And so they're doing it on their own. I mean, obviously with some of the capacity building that we're providing, but nonetheless, they're owning their issues. So, with the lower level Al-Shabaab defectors through the various defections programs that the government is building, are seeing where they have opportunities to come in and get training. They have opportunities to be reconciled and reintegrated into society and accepted by society, because the Somalis, it's very interesting to observe their reconciliation processes are incredible, and you see that they receive and accept these individuals back into these communities once they go through this kind of very emotional, very intense reconciliation process. So I think if we start to see more economic opportunities particularly for the younger people, I think the figure is about 70% of the population is under the age of like 35, where we're seeing this, throughout the world. Again, we need to focus on how we can facilitate economic opportunities for the younger people so that they see that they can be contributing partners to Somali society and even to the regional, to the region, to the Horn, as you have exchanges. I guess the last point I like to say is, with what's happening in the region right now, particularly with Eritrea and with Ethiopia and other things, they're seeing great opportunities for regional economic integration, where they can start building these coalitions to provide economic opportunities and also improve security through these collaborative engagements and bilateral agreements, multilateral agreements between these various actors who are, really starting to take control and working closely with one another to facilitate cooperation on all levels. Thank you.
All right, very good. Well, so Somalia, lots of challenges, but many reasons to be optimistic, sounds like. Marty Dale, thank you very much for being on Real Talk USA today. We've been listening to Martin Dale, who's Chargé d'Affaires for U.S. Embassy Somalia. Marty, thank you so much for being on our program this week.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be with you.
And now we have with us on the phone Ms. Mariyam Cementwala, I hope I pronounced it right, a policy advisor at the Office of International Religious Freedom in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. She's in Washington, D.C. We're quite pleased that we have a chance to speak with you today, ma'am, because, seeing that we just celebrated International Religious Freedom Day on Saturday, October 27th, and in addition to CVE issues, we we are hoping to learn a few things about religious freedom as well today. So welcome, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us on Real Talk USA.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Now, before we get to the questions we have for you on countering violent extremism and religious freedom, I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself, if you will.
Sure. I actually was an immigrant to the United States myself, and I came from India when I was 7. My parents thought of the United States as a land of bountiful opportunities where people are judged on their merits, because I was born blind in India, and my aunt, who lived in Chicago, encouraged my dad to consider moving to the United States, where his daughter would have opportunities and not be called what my dad called poor thing. Wanted to move me away from the stigma of poor thing and raise me in an environment where he felt that I would be judged on my abilities and my merits rather than on a physical or other issue that would basically color people's perspectives. And so I moved here when I was young, and I studied at the University of California, Berkeley. I studied political science with a focus on international relations, and I studied Arabic in college in an immersion program. And I was always interested in the world and in languages and in international affairs. And then I went on, and later I studied human rights law through a program called the Mitchell Scholarship, named after Senator George Mitchell, who helped to forge the Good Friday Peace Agreement between warring factions, as you may remember, in Northern Ireland. So learning about religious tolerance, religious freedom, countering violent extremism, was something that happened early on for me in my, formative, I would say, college years, because Senator Mitchell was a real inspiration. And so I studied human rights law with a focus on disability, but then, went on to law school and did some other things. I, helped sort of in the interim between the Mitchell Scholarship and law school work on the drafting of the treaty called the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the United Nations. So I was in my mid-20s, early to mid-20s, and I was sitting with all kinds of seasoned diplomats at the New Zealand mission at night, sometimes until 1 in the morning or 2 in the morning, working out language, because I was part of a group of non-government organizations. So there I saw the power of the voice of NGOs and the human rights dialogue, and that was really fascinating. And not only did I see the power, I was part of leveraging that power. And so that was really a great experience. And I went on to law school and found law firm practice kind of boring, actually, and an ambassador, a former ambassador to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, really encouraged me to take the Foreign Service test. And I said, okay, I'll give this a shot, because I was very interested in international affairs even then. And he said, you have all of these language skills and you have this interest, and you should try that. And I said, well, I'll keep trying it until I fail the test. And I kept passing each level of the Foreign Service examination process, because there are several steps, there are several processes to get into the diplomatic corps of the United States. And so I entered the diplomatic corps in March of 2011. And my journey was a little bit circuitous, because I had done these other things that were very interesting and fun and rewarding in their own right. But I have found that there is nothing quite as interesting and as fulfilling as embodying the values of the United States overseas and even at home. I served in Abu Dhabi, in New Delhi, in Riyadh, and now I'm at the Office of International Religious Freedom in Washington, D.C. And in each of these places, I have worked on a panoply of really fascinating issues, from internal dynamics and countering violent extremism and understanding sectarianism and women's issues in Saudi Arabia, to covering the election of 2014, which is an election where over 500 million people voted in India, the world's largest democracy. And covering Muslim outrage issues. And, in Abu Dhabi, covering the UAE-Egypt relationship at a time of real crisis. And also covering the Federal National Council, how their quasi-parliamentary advisory body works, and how they give voice to their citizens in the way that domestically they, find appropriate. And women's issues in the UAE, human rights issues in the UAE. I worked on the counterterrorism report, the human rights report, the religious freedom report. So, it's been a lot of fun, but it's also been really, really rich and rewarding. And it kind of can be encapsulated by one story early on in the UAE, where a cab driver says to me in Urdu, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, where do you think I'm from?" As he's driving me to the U.S. Embassy, and he couldn't figure out, and he named every country under the sun in South Asia and in Central Asia, and he finally got frustrated. He said, "Why don't you just tell me?" And I said, "Well, where did I say I was going?" And he said, "Well, you said you were going to the U.S. Embassy, but I thought you were going for a visa."
Oh.
"Oh, I asked you to drop me at the first entrance, which is the staff entrance." He said, "You work there?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "They let you work there?" And I said, "Yeah, they don't let me work there. They want me to work there. They need me to work there. I'm an American." And that really blew his mind, because he didn't think that an American, and particularly an American diplomat, looked like someone like me, a woman who is blind, who covers in a hijab, a rida, who carries a cane. And he said, "But you're Muslim, and you cover, and you can't see. And so how do you work there?" And I said, "Well, I work there because they want me to work there, they need me to work there, and they value what I bring to the table, because I bring a different kind of understanding and perspective." And so that really feeds into what I do now, and the work that we do every day in this office on promoting human rights, promoting religious freedom, and mainstreaming the importance of human rights protections and religious freedom guarantees into our counterterrorism strategies and our approach on countering violent extremism.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, actually, because you work in the Office of International Religious Freedom, but on countering violent extremism. And what is it like working at the intersection of these two issues?
It's really fascinating, and the reason it is that from an academic standpoint, or a standpoint of personal interest, given my background, I am pious and devout, and I always have been, and I've never seen that as something that should be a hindrance that promotes violence. In fact, diverse faith traditions reject violence, embracing love, acceptance, and peace. So, from an academic standpoint, I thought, my intuition said that piety and religiosity should not really be the drivers of violent extremism. And professionally, how I've dressed, what I've observed, whether it's observing Ramadan or what have you, has never been an issue. We in the United States separate church and state, but we also believe in the fundamental first freedom, the freedom of religion, and we embody that in our work in missions and posts around the world. So if a strong moral compass should encourage people to reject violence, then what is it that, feeds violence, and specifically the kind of violence that leads people to join radical groups or extremist groups. So in my professional role as a foreign service officer and diplomat, I wanted to work to understand these issues and to sort of test out my own intuitions and see how they were borne out by the facts. And here's what we know. Research findings from the Department of State's Conflict and Stabilization Operations Bureau have actually shown that governments need not fear those people whose practices seem outside the mainstream or very traditional, or those who are particularly pious or conservative. In fact, State Department research has shown that religiously devout people actually tend to be less prone to embracing or following tracks that would lead to violent extremism. Other research has shown that populations that are intolerant, exclusionary, or supremacist in their views tend to support violent extremist groups. That's how a little bit of my personal background blends into my professional work, and that's sort of what led me to the work at the intersection of these issues.
Interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about your office and its role in CVE?
Sure. In 1998, Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act, and you mentioned the anniversary of the IRFA, which marked its 20th year.
Yeah.
And under this act, it mandated the creation of the Office of International Religious Freedom with bipartisan support. And this office and this issue set retains that support even today. Congress required the State Department to create an ambassadorial position, the position of the ambassador at large, to oversee the work of this office and promote religious freedom around the globe. So our mission of advancing religious freedom is a matter of national security and a core priority of Trump administration. Our ambassador at large for international religious freedom, Sam Brownback, has a conviction that is shared widely by other policymakers and academics, and that is that promoting religious freedom is intrinsically linked to enhancing global security, promoting economic prosperity, and countering violent extremism. So among the things that we do on CVE in this office, as I mentioned earlier, is mainstreaming religious freedom and a human rights orientation into interagency and congressionally mandated strategies. That means making sure that a strong, a robust ethos of human rights is enshrined in all of our legal frameworks, and that, the language of respect for religious freedom is embedded in any action plan, strategy document, guiding principle, or strategy, or sort of white paper on CVE, counterterrorism, or national security. Because research is now supporting, and we ardently believe, that respect for human rights and religious freedom will engender an atmosphere more resilient to violent extremism. And I can tell you a little bit more about the office. Okay. In terms of our sort of nuts and bolts structure, we do all kinds of things.
Okay.
Some of our work is behind the scenes, and some of our work is very public. So you won't often see us advocating for people who have been religiously persecuted to be set free, because some of that work is done, for instance, in quiet diplomatic channels. But some of our work is very public. So we publish every year the State Department's International Religious Freedom Report, which looks at the state of religious freedom in every country and, across the globe. And, that would not happen, that work would not happen without the participation of civil society, of NGOs, of academics, of people who come and who report at the local embassy level, but then also to us directly in Washington to highlight what the challenges are, and then, that report becomes an advocacy tool. Well, it's both an awareness-raising tool and an advocacy tool. And so, that kind of work is very public. Another example of some of the private work we do is, the State Department has, since 1998, spent tens of millions of dollars in foreign assistance programming targeted to addressing the root causes of intolerance in societies and conflict mitigation. So that is directly linked to addressing, the factors, the drivers of radicalization and recruitment, right? And that's some of the work that happens very quietly behind the scenes that we do on a day-to-day basis.
So it's interesting. That's what USAU has been doing this week is trying to get CSOs in different parts of the continent, especially the Horn and the Lake Chad Basin area, and CSOs working in those regions to talk to each other, to see how they can talk to their respective governments, regionally work together to counter violent extremism. It's been a very interesting conversation this past 4 days.
Yes, I can imagine. And in fact, there's very strong research to support the work of these CSOs because very recently the UN Development Program, UNDP, published a study called Journey to Extremism. And the study is very clear in its finding that over 70% of people who joined terrorist groups did so because they either witnessed or they knew firsthand about government security forces abusing or killing or torturing loved ones or friends, and that became a driver, became a trigger. UK-based NGO International Alert has found similar examples, particularly in Africa, of what the drivers are, and International Alert's research very much resonates the findings that often young people don't turn to violent extremist organizations because of an ideological underpinning. Most people don't really understand the intricacies of ideology. It becomes a secondary or tertiary trigger. The initial trigger is a real profound sense of injustice or voicelessness, a lack of political participation, and a sense of disenfranchisement.
And a sense of lack of purpose.
If people can work together with governments to address that, then, that's a lot of the heavy lifting that collectively we can do to mitigate the drivers of violent extremism. And so, one of the things my office points to is the exclusion of religious minorities. And that's why I sort of brought up early on the research that shows that people who are particularly pious or conservative are not the ones you have to worry about. They're not the problem in terms of what the triggers are or who you have to fear joining a violent extremist organization. They know their faith. And if they know their faith, then they're not going to be the ones jumping to join a terrorist group. It's when people don't have direction, and it's not just economic marginalization. It's time and time again, we've heard this and we've read this in studies and research that has been conducted, but it's not a sense of economic marginalization alone. It is a real sense of political marginalization and exclusion in society, a feeling of us versus them, of otherness, and then violent extremist organizations play upon that identity politics to recruit. And so when you have vulnerable populations, it is absolutely clear that the drivers of violent extremism can be complex and nuanced, but when you have vulnerable populations, you know that violent extremist groups will prey upon their local grievances and their local identity politics to target them.
Yeah, we had the same feeling from another CVE expert we spoke to for the radio show a couple of weeks back from Pakistan. It's interesting how some of these issues are actually underlying most of the CVE issues in different regions of the globe. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that there are solutions to these problems. And one of the challenges we have is when you're in the CVE space, and that's a space driven by national security concerns. How do you balance national security concerns with human rights protection?
Yes.
And the answers are not always clear and easy.
Yes.
But the example that I like to point to is, when you're thinking about something as simple as how a state is going to be responsive to a minority population. Well, the security forces that serve the minority populations, as the majority populations, have to be representative of those populations. And there has to be trust among the security forces and the population. So that means that states actively have to work to build that trust. That means security forces, police forces, their leaders, and their working level officers have to be recruited from the
community
of the population.
The diversity of the community, yeah.
They also have to sit down together with communities, and here I'd say in particular, minority communities, and specifically religious minorities, to talk about how they're going to work together to combat unrest and to build trust and to, forge common solutions to problems. Because that's the only way you get around these hard issues where you both balance the human rights concerns and also look at issues from a lens of national security, which is no doubt very important.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier on a few times that there have been quite a few studies done around the CVE, and I wonder, can we predict and mitigate any dangers from current or future violent extremism organizations?
Yes, we can, and I'll go back to a couple things that I may have already said, which is,
Yeah, you did mention the UNDP study,
that the drivers of violent extremism are complex and nuanced. There's no doubt that the absence or abrogation of human rights, and specifically religious freedom guarantees, improves the climate for terrorists to recruit and radicalize from vulnerable populations. We know that future terrorist organizations will prey upon local populations and exploit local grievances. And again, I refer you back to the UNDP study, Journey to Extremism, which found that over 70% of terrorist recruits were radicalized by witnessing government action, such as witnessing the killing or arrest of a family member or friend by government security forces. This study, the most recent Global Terrorism Index for 2017, and other scholars have shown how state-sanctioned violence, torture, killings, different forms of security force abuse manifest in driving radicalization to violence. Other studies, such as one conducted by the Department of State's own Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, has shown that personal experiences of corruption, such as paying bribes at checkpoints or for public services, will also generate the kind of grievances that can feed into the cycle of recruitment, radicalization, that terrorist organizations will prey upon. And, as I mentioned, international alert, the work of peace-building organizations, we've heard the same message. Recently, in sharing their research with us, International Alert said that in places like Mali and the Sahel, among other regions around the globe, their work has found that time and time again, young people are drawn to violent extremism after feeling a very profound sense of voicelessness. So it's not, as I said, not just economic marginalization, but a real sense of political or participatory disenfranchisement that leads them to, join a violent extremist organization. And so these conversations and studies highlight the nexus between terrorist radicalization and recruitment in the absence of good governance, human rights protections, and accountability. And you need all three. And, we've also looked at research, for instance, from Dr. Nilay Saeed, who's a political scientist at the State University of New York in Brockport. And his work specifically looks at the correlation between religious repression and terrorism.
That was going to be my next question. Yes, please go ahead.
I was going to say his work has highlighted the linkage between the absence of human rights and terrorist radicalization and recruitment from the standpoint of how restrictions on religious freedom, and he points to the case of blasphemy laws, can increase the potential for violence towards specific religious communities, governments, and even in other countries. So the research is there, and a number of studies, though they may sort of characterize themselves differently or use different words, support Dr. Saeed's finding. So studies, for instance, by the NGO Mercy Corps, have examined how political marginalization, including of religious communities or on a religious basis, create a real and perceived sense of injustice, which is in turn a key driver of conflict. And their work further indicates that when people or communities begin to believe that the government is more responsive, accountable, and fair, support for armed violence and the sectarian groups that may perpetuate them decreases. So the research is, at this point, pointing in a very strong and incontrovertible direction that no matter how you look at it, there may be a lot of factors that may trigger an individual joining a violent extremist group, but there is no doubt that if you have an absence of human rights and you have an absence of religious freedom guarantees, that is a central force. And that is, so I look at this, frankly, from the standpoint of risk mitigation. You know that there are a number of factors that are driving people to violent extremism, but you know that one factor that you can do something about very clearly is the climate or the environment of human rights and religious freedom protection. So do something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just that simple. And this can happen at a very local level. So, for the purposes of your listeners who may be activists, advocates, academics,
and hopefully government actors. And hopefully government actors as well.
Yeah, and hopefully government actors. Absolutely. Government actors, religious actors, community leaders. When they're looking at how to influence government, how to influence governments to draft and implement strategies on countering violent extremism, a really basic step, a really basic mitigating factor is, are the strategies, are the plans taking into account the factors that give life to the causes of anger to themselves, right? The causes of marginalization. So in other words, are there ways in which people can worship freely in groups or individually in a nonviolent way?
Yeah.
Are there ways in which every member of every community can have access to public services, education, employment, regardless of gender, race, ethnic identity, religious identity, sect identity, etc.? And if you take away those drivers that can cause anger, resentment, and a feeling of marginalization and discrimination, then you mitigate the risks that increase the propensity for terrorist radicalization and recruitment. If you say, okay, in my countering violent extremism strategy, there's going to be a prong in which, we look at how security forces are going to be held accountable, how different groups or actors in society, be it employers or what have you, are going to be held accountable for acts of social marginalization, discrimination, or unrest, then that is one critical way in which you've attacked the problem of violent extremism. And anybody can play a part in that, because anybody can as a member of an NGO or a thought provoker, an academic activist, as I said, working with the government to forge or formulate a CVE strategy or a national action plan on counterterrorism and countering violent extremism, can say, what we need to do is ensure and urge that there are strong human rights protections, a strong legal framework where there is due process of law, where there are, essentially where there is a rights-based language, right, that is embedded, and therefore implementation of those rights and protection of those rights. And, that is a recipe to at least mitigate the drivers of violent extremism.
Wonderful. These are some practical terms of what each one of us, even as individuals, can look at our roles and our parts in countering violent extremism. That's interesting. Thank you for that. So recently, Secretary of State Pompeo really elevated the issue of religious freedom by hosting a ministerial to advance religious freedom. Had this been done anywhere else before, and what was the ministerial and its underlying purpose?
This was a really proud moment for our office because it was the most significant initiative and undertaking. And in answer to your question, had this ever been done before, this was historic. It was the first time anywhere in the world that a ministerial dedicated to religious freedom as a foreign policy priority had ever been held. So ministerial to advance religious freedom had never been held prior. And it was fitting, given the basis of the United States' very existence having been on the basis of the struggle for religious freedom, that this 3-day event was hosted at the State Department in Washington, D.C. Vice President Pence, Secretary of State Pompeo, Deputy Secretary Sullivan, and Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, welcomed hundreds of members of civil society, leaders of spiritual and religious communities from all faiths, and over 80 government delegations from across the globe to discuss how we can work together to stop religious persecution, to protect religious groups or those who choose to practice no faith at all. Promote respect, tolerance, and intra as well as interfaith religious dialogue, and thereby foster a more peaceful, economically prosperous, and secure world in which we mitigate the drivers of violent extremism. There was robust participation, and people felt extremely inspired by the stories of the victims of religious persecution who reminded everyone of our common sense of purpose and what we're fighting for on a day-to-day level. The U.S. government reiterated its support for religious freedom by releasing the Potomac Declaration and the Potomac Plan of Action at the ministerial's conclusion. And these two documents serve to reiterate Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as provide recommendations for how to promote religious freedom around the world. And we also released 6 statements outlining concerns regarding those specific countries as well as thematic issues. And one of the statements was specifically on how counterterrorism laws can be used as a false pretext for religious repression. But references to countering violent extremism and the linkage of CVE to religious repression are smattered all across these documents. So the ministerial was a really pivotal moment for us and our foreign policy priorities, but it was a pivotal moment also globally because of how it brought civil society, religious groups, and governments together in the same room. And what was really unique was on the third day of the ministerial, which was a day that initially was going to be a government-focused day, and from a standpoint of sort of, the dialogue, the official plenary sessions was a government-focused day, but what was really unique is that civil society leaders and NGOs, religious leaders, the whole smattering of diverse groups were in the same room with government leaders. So government leaders making statements about how they were going to promote religious freedom or what they were going to do or what actions they were going to take were making those statements and promises and commitments in direct view of the civil society that keeps governments in check and keeps governments honest. And so that was really, really unique. And it was, I think, a highlight of the ministerial, that you had government and civil society in the same room at the same time, and
talking about religion,
an informal opportunity to talk to each other.
It sounds like it was quite an event. Now, obviously, we're not going to be able to talk about all of what CVE is in these few minutes, but is there anything that I haven't asked that you want to highlight regarding CVE or international religious freedom or anything between those two topics?
I think I'll close with this.
Okay.
Developing a strategy of prevention. Now people are sort of changing the dialogue from CVE, countering violent extremism, to PVE, preventing violent extremism. And I would say this. This is the U.S. government's position, and it is really the day-to-day bread and butter work of what we do in my office and really all across the State Department. And that is that developing a strategy of prevention that will stop terrorist organizations from gaining traction in the future begins with the integration of a human rights-based perspective and a robust legal framework of human rights protection to include the respect for religious freedom and protection of religious groups, freedom from religious persecution, non-discrimination, in education, employment, and other fields. That is the basis of, I think, how you think about a recipe for PVE and CVE. And that work is not always easy, but working to advance human rights and religious freedom isn't always easy. But it increases our chances in creating a safer world in which violent extremism faces greater resistance in taking root.
Thank you for that. That was Ms. Mariyam Cementwala, Policy Advisor at the Office of International Religious Freedom in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Thank you very much for being on Real Talk USA, ma'am.
It was my pleasure. Thank you again for having me, and I hope that your listeners were able to get something practical and useful from this.
Thank you very much. And this is me, Ms. Gabwa Thaddasa, signing off for Real Talk USA on 105.3 Afro FM. Have a good evening, everyone.
Real Talk USA.